Non-traditional learners. I'm the chairperson for this session, Sam Illingworth from Edinburgh Napier University, and we're going to have two different talks, both from multi-person teams, each of which will be about 20 minutes in length, following which there'll be 10 minutes of questions. And again, just a reminder for our online audiences to please also ask questions, and we can field those in the time. So I'll just introduce both sets of speakers and then invite them up one by one. So firstly, we'll be hearing from the Open University in Scotland team about student engagement in a I'll just wait for that to finish. Okay, thank you. So, sorry, we'll be hearing from the Open University in Scotland team about student engagement in an on-campus context. I'm going to speak quickly, then it's no longer my problem. And then we're going to be hearing about embedding research on student engagement in learning, lessons from the first Welsh Collaborative Enhancement Project from Myfanwy, Davies, and also from Nyah, Lowe, who are presenting here. So 20 minutes each, followed by 10 minutes of questions, and I'd like to begin by inviting up the Open University in Scotland team to talk about student engagement in a non-campus context. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're here from the Open University in Scotland, and we're going to talk to you today about how we engage our students in a supported distance learning context. I'm Vicky Soper, and I'm Senior Manager, Access, Participation and Success. I'll leave my colleagues to introduce themselves as we move through our presentation, but for now, I'll hand over to Patty to start us off.
Thanks, Vicky, and thank you all for joining us today here and online. I'm Patty Waters. I'm the Senior Manager of Learning Curriculum and Quality. And to begin, I'd like to introduce a few of our 21,300 students in Scotland to provide an overview of the institutional environment that informs our student engagement context. First, you'll see Stuart. He studied access modules when he started with the Open University in Scotland. And he did that like 530 of our students during the 2021 and 2022 academic year. They all started in access courses. Stuart also worked full-time while studying, along with 49% of our student body. And critically for him and his family, he was able to stay in his rural community to complete his studies flexibly at a distance. We meet students where they are. 23% of our student body live in a rural or remote area. As we move to the next slide, you'll see our significant reach to around the country. The OU serves students in every parliamentary constituency and all 32 Scottish local authority areas, from the Highlands to the Islands to the borders, with the highest participation rates in rural and remote areas. It is important to note that while local authority areas with dense urban geography and high levels of deprivation often have lower rates of student participation, in Scotland, the Open University recruits more students from the most deprived areas than the least deprived areas. Last academic year, 19% of new undergraduates lived in SIMD 20 areas, and 41% of new undergraduates lived in SIMD 40 areas. Now let's move on to the next slide to meet another student. Now this is Elise. She is currently in her third year. She left school without the qualifications needed to pursue a university education, and that's similar to 20% of our students. They come to us without the qualifications needed to enter university, and 18% of new undergraduates with the university have an HND or an HNC. Elise manages multiple health complications and conditions, and 26% of our students declare a disability. She, along with 68% of our students, receives a part-time fee grant from SAS, and 71% of our students earn less than £25,000 per year. And I'd like to introduce you to one more student. This is Abdullah. An important part of his journey has been being able to have the ability to study while also working full-time so that he could earn an income to support his family and increase his opportunities for employment. a huge 74% of our student body either works full-time or part-time. And the OUIS, Open University in Scotland, plays a critical role in providing access to part-time study for students in Scotland. 68% of all part-time study in Scotland is done through the Open University in Scotland. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues, Vicky, Eve, and Fanny, to discuss how we engage in our diverse population of learners across the width and breadth of Scotland and work to create a sense of belonging and in our unique context. Vicky?
Thank you. So I've noted on the slide some examples of the different ways in which we at the Open University engage our students and learners to reach their goals. We have our OpenLearn platform with over 1,000 free educational resources, our Open Learning Champions, which is a network of over 300 members, which I'll talk to more later, 85 short courses on offer, 26 micro-credentials in the market, over 540 access modules studied in 21-22, and over 27,750 OU students across Scotland on our core undergrad and postgrad modules. We're in a really unique position due to the nature of our online offering, which means we have the opportunity for significant geographic reach across Scotland. This means we're really proactive in our work to engage learners at all levels, especially in harder to reach remote and rural areas. As Patty mentioned, we have students in all Scottish Parliament constituencies. We work with schools in 29 local authority areas, and we partner with 16 regional colleges. I've noted on the slide the options that we offer to meet learners at any point in their journey, and I'm going to talk in more detail about a couple of examples of how we are proactively engaging with harder to reach communities. Firstly, as an example of our proactive approach, this spring we've been running a Skills for Business roadshow event. These events offered advice and solutions to help SMEs and levy payers upskill their teams, centering on our offer around the Flexible Workforce Development Fund, OpenLearn and Opportunity Hub. The roadshow placed a strong emphasis on reaching businesses across rural Scotland. 167 businesses registered across the 7 events, which were delivered in partnership with regional chambers of commerce and other industry partners. We are extremely proud of our OpenLearn platform, on which we host over 1,000 free open educational resources. Anyone can access these resources to improve study or employability skills, earn a digital badge or statement of participation, or just to get inspired. In 21-22, OpenLearn had over 297,000 visitors from Scotland. To ensure that access to this platform is reaching those that might benefit from it most, we created the OpenLearn Champions project, which brings our free open educational resources to communities across Scotland. The project has been running since 2015 and equips a wide network of people from third sector organisations to colleges and libraries with the knowledge and skills to use our free resources to help learners in their communities. Next steps for these learners may involve further informal learning, developing skills for employment, or transition into formal study. The Open Learning Champions Network now has over 400 members who have existing relationships with people and communities that we are keen to engage with. This enables OpenLearn resources to be introduced within a trusted and supportive relationship. I'm now going to hand over to Eve, who's going to talk about how we utilise student voice to engage our learners.
Right, I feel I've got the power because I've got the clicker. Thanks, Vicky. My name is Ewelina Granka, and I'm Access, Participation and Success Manager at the U in Scotland. And I'll now take you through our approach to student voice that we use to engage students and create a sense of belonging in community. So just for context, at the Open University, we define student voice as a student engagement in quality enhancement. And in an on-campus setting, our students recognize the huge importance of a student voice as a crucial part of their journey and link it to student satisfaction. Institutional vision for student voice is set in a student charter that we've developed in partnership with the Student Association, as well as in the OU and OU Student Association relationship agreement. So these documents make up the foundation stone on which our OU community is built and illustrate our shared values and what we can expect from each other. To engage our diverse student community, as you can imagine, as an online provider, most of our engagement opportunities are online with occasional in-person offerings. Having online options offers flexibility and accessible options to all of our students, no matter where they're based, and they can plan around their hectic lives. OU staff involved in the student activities is guided by the Student Voice Action Plan and Steering Group, which is a partnership initiative between university and student association that provides overall guidance and strategic direction for student voice. And utilizing work of Sherry Arnstein that some of you might be aware of, we aim to provide opportunities for students to engage at the level of engagement ladder that best suits them. So if we're thinking about the ladder of engagement from the top, we've got partnership, collaboration, involvement, consultation, and information. On a slide here, you'll see the example of numerous student voice activities all over Open University. And many of these are organized via student association who have responsibility for collective representation. And worth noting that we included here only some important elements of a very complex picture. So I'm just quickly going to read through it. On the top, we've got partnership working that includes scholarship, relationship agreement that I've mentioned, student consultation, and faculty nation-based initiatives, representation, governance committees, steering groups, catch-ups between staff and student association representatives, panels, curriculum design, library, careers and employability panels, surveys, national student survey, student experience, grant trackers. And these initiatives happen across all of our four nations where representatives are present and contribute to unique insights of student population and behaviors. We all champion student voice and develop nation-based initiatives. And I'm going to talk a little bit about unique initiatives in Scotland. So for instance, in Scotland, we continue to support a Big Bladder event series. It's a concept of a bladder event where students can gather together in an informal environment to discuss issues of interest and concern. The idea was conceived by OU Student Association student rep who had run similar events successfully over Facebook. And in November 2020, my team, with input and collaboration from colleagues across the university, worked with the Student Association to organize a Big Bladder event as a part of the Student Voice Week and developed it into a regular series of events. Another initiative that I want to highlight is the Student Voice Week that I've mentioned. It is a part of a series of events across the Open University that happens normally in November and aims to engage the whole student body. And we've got a Scottish-specific events that we do host during that week. The next initiatives that I think it's very important to highlight are the University Student Consultation, which is a process that makes use of online forums and meetings to consult students on a range of topics. The agenda for consultation is set by a group made up of university staff and representatives from Student Association. All students have the opportunity to volunteer, and by participating can directly influence the changes the university makes. In Scotland, we run in-person and online consultation to cater to all. And last but not least, I want to mention a Career Experience Student Reference Group that we've established following the publication of Corporate Parenting Plan at the Open University in Scotland and the creation of a steering group where colleagues at the university have engaged with students who have declared career experience to establish student reference group. They do meet at least twice a year to review our corporate parenting action plan and set the priorities for the coming year. They represent the student voice at the corporate parenting steering group meetings and co-produced initiatives to support our career experience students, including the Digital Inclusion Fund and the contact from OU Scotland Care's inbox by contributing to some of our newsletters. So I hope I've given you enough context, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague Fanny, who will continue conversation about student voice.
I've got handwritten notes. I wasn't as prepared as them. Printing them all out. I don't have an awful lot on my slides, but as Eve said, I am Myfanwy. I am former Vice President Engagement. So I've worked with OU in Scotland and the wider Open University for 4 years as a student rep. So I just wanted to touch on kind of some of the challenges that you would face as a student rep if you come to study at the OU, and how the partnership working really plays out in reality. Hopefully there are some things in there that you can take back to your, as we call them, brick university setting, and really have some practical examples that might work for some of your non-traditional learners as well. So Eve has already touched on it, but the relationship agreement between the Students' Association and the OU is very important, but it's not just this is how far we're going to go. It just sets the baseline and the conversations that it's renewed every year, so it's not just a document that kind of sits on the shelf and nobody thinks about or talks about for 5 years until they're like, oh, we've really got to look at this, and you know, what can we take out of it? It's always what more can we put into it as the minimum standard. So one of the additions 2 years ago was an agreement from the university that on every senior recruitment panel, there would be a student rep as a full member of the recruitment panel to really make sure that the student voice goes right from a staff member joining the university. The student reps, obviously every university has them, and it's really nice to come up here because I can say Students' Association and people don't think, is that different from a student union, because they're mostly called Students' Associations here. So the unique position of being a student rep, you can see from the stats already, I think. Most people work full-time. I worked full-time throughout my whole 4 years of being a VP. And you're in a volunteer post, unless you're the president or deputy president, often work in a 9-to-5 job. And although people do have outside of office hour meetings, I feel like if you were asked to come online at 8 p.m. 3 days a week just to talk to students, you might not like that. So there are very creative ways that we can go about engaging with the OU. So some of it can be really about building a relationship with the staff members, and when they come to us or came to me with a project, it would be a discussion about what's the most effective use of my time and how can I fit it in around everything else that's going on, whether it's having a pre-meeting and then actually receiving feedback from the staff member. So it's not just we had a one-to-one conversation and oh, they will consider that. It's actually, okay, so this is the difference that your feedback made, although I was in a very lucky position to be able to attend most meetings. And being from the south of the border, I've never heard that expression as many times as I had in the last 24 hours. It's a very unique challenge. I've never really been to Scotland besides holidays, so how do you represent students as a VP that you've never really met and you don't really have the opportunity to go out for a coffee vid or bump into on campus? So from the OU in Scotland's perspective, I've always been really grateful to receive the opportunity to be given context and kind of relevant training in understanding the issues specific to Scotland, but also being given the platform through OU in Scotland to go and speak to students directly, because there is none of the flyers walking around on campus. It's all emails online. Like they said, it's all rural, so even whilst in England, it's quite feasible to bring most people together in like London or one of the biggest cities. Not always very feasible in Scotland, and you can only reach a very small percentage of students by saying, oh, here is a face-to-face event. So it's really about understanding those. And also, in terms of partnership, it's never just about them telling me, oh, we've got this idea, can you support with that? It's me saying, I've got this idea, can you support me with this? And they would always bend backwards. I'm doing a really good job at talking them up here. But the genuine partnership of always being supported in what I came up with as well. So one of the examples that Eve had already talked about is the Big Bladder. It wasn't my initiative, it was a student in Scotland. You've got, as a volunteer, very limited resources to actually do the operational planning of it. So it started off as a student initiative and then got given operational resources and kind of the comms to reach more students. But the one I really wanted to touch on, which gave the PR team at OU in Scotland a great time, is when I decided it would be great if I could log into OU in Scotland's Twitter account and just be a student and talk to students there without any supervision. It was a great idea. They supported me, as they do in all of my crazy things, and we got retweeted and went a bit viral by Iron Brew, because I didn't realize how controversial that was in Scotland. But it's really given me, after all the talking about risks and how to mitigate them, but it was them directly giving me a platform to go and spend the day just talking to students, asking them the questions that I needed to ask, and also having just an open platform for them to say whatever it is that they needed to say that they might not have the opportunity otherwise. So I hope that gives a sense of how it is from a student rep perspective. And I don't know if I'm passing back to Vicky or our chair to take questions.
Okay. Thanks very much. Are there any questions, please, from the audience? And online as well, please remember to ask. I'll kick off with a question then, if that's okay. So what do you think the unique challenges are for Open University students in Scotland as opposed to students on a traditional campus in Scotland? And has that come out at all, do you think, in the work that you've been doing? Directed to anyone to answer that.
So I think one of the biggest challenges for our students is, as Fanny touched on, that sense of belonging and sense of community without a campus base. And that's something that we work quite hard within our team to try and create a sense of belonging and a sense of student identity. For our students especially, being a student is probably just one part of their identity. There might be a professional, a mum, a dad, a carer, have other responsibilities. So it's allowing them to fully integrate into their student identity without that detracting from all of their other responsibilities. And that's why our student voice work is so important for what we do, because we want to hear from them what they need from us and how to create that sense of community. We were actually just talking about, from a session we were in this morning, the definition of belonging, which I think is quite interesting for our students because we are a Four Nations university. It's really important for us to understand, we talk a lot about being the Open University in Scotland, and we need to understand whether our students identify as Scottish students or whether they identify with the faculty or the module that they're studying, because there's no point in us trying to promote a sense of Scottish identity and Scottish belonging if that's not what our students identify with. So that's a big piece of work for us as a team going forward, is really trying to facilitate that sense of belonging, but based on what our students are telling us they need rather than us telling them.
That's great, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, please, Claire. I'll just wait for a microphone to come to you if that's okay.
Hello, my name's Claire Garden. I'm from Edinburgh Napier University. I recognise a lot of what you've described your challenges as being with non-traditional students actually in the work that I'm doing on student voice in a institution that has walls. And so I think we've got a lot that we can learn from you. I think you're obviously way ahead of us. I suppose one of the challenges that our student reps have is actually communicating with our students who are working and who have caring responsibilities and who aren't necessarily all on campus when they are. Do you have any advice for me, for them, and how they can sort of interact with their do the representation that they really want to do?
I wish I had a magic wand, and that's what, when I first stood, I was like, I'm going to solve all the engagement problems here, and there'll be this one thing that I'll do that will be the be all and end all. I think I don't have a solution for you, but I think this was last year. It was actually at one of the student consultation events. One of the students said, I just need you to be there. I might not respond to your email, I might not respond to your survey, or I might not follow you on all the social media, but I just need you to consistently be there so that when the time comes, then I know that all of these things are available and that I can then reach out. And I think that's a really hard truth, that not everybody wants to engage with it. And I think there are unique challenges, yes, at the OU, but I think when you boil it down to the actual issues, they are very similar across all institutions, and I've engaged with lots of other students' association and union elected reps, and I don't have one solution, but continuing to do the things, like you can see that you might have click-through rates, but they're not response rates. Obviously, our predominant method of comms is online and emails, and kind of relying on people a little bit to find us, but just being there, I think, is quite powerful.
And I know that this isn't necessarily just about student representation, but something to consider is that student voice comes from a variety of locations, and so we're building up stronger links between our student support teams and AP and access, participation, and support, and then my role as well. So we're trying to bring that all together, and that's a way that we can also capture that student voice that we might get only through that kind of way. But I think that's something to make sure that we're considering. Yeah.
Any other questions at all, please? And just looking across. Yes, please. Just wait for the microphone. Great. Thank you very much.
I'm Maggie King from Heriot-Watt University, and we have 5 campuses, online partnership students, so we have many challenges with trying to engage students. And I think post-pandemic, we've noticed a decline in the traditional engagement in student surveys, for example. And I just wonder, for you, with the OU model, have you found more recent years any forms of engagement that have been more effective than surveys, or surprisingly more effective that we weren't sure would be? So I'd just be interested in what the type of engagement is in surveys and compared to the other methods you described there. Thank you.
There are definitely, I think, ways. One of the very good examples I have is throw them out a very controversial question that's just literally like a yes or no. Everybody wants to respond to those. But I think students are, and we talk about this at the OU Association, whatever you want to call it, we talk about it all the time, that students are surveyed out and students don't want to keep answering the same question. So I think one of the key things, and that I've seen from the association, is that actually when you look at it, you've already kind of got the data on what you want to ask from students. You might just need to actually speak to a different department who has done that survey and is really holding on to those results sometimes. But I also, one of the things that we often do is, I want to say, piggyback onto OU events, which kind of feel official to students, and then as a student rep I can then come in. At the end of student consultation meetings, for example, we always do like an open mic type thing where the staff members leave the room, and oh boy, they've got things to say. Like as soon as the staff members, who could probably more easily solve their problems, leave the room, they're like, I want you to solve this problem as a student rep. But I think a variety, for us, the key is to bring students together real time, because they don't get a lot of the interaction. There isn't a lot of compulsory like tutorials. Even if you get exams, it's at the end of your module. A lot of, if anybody knows the background of the OU, there used to be loads of day schools, not really a thing anymore. So offering kind of the same thing over and over, because to a mum, like with a 2-year-old kid, a 7 o'clock meeting is, I'm not a mum, but probably doesn't really work. Whereas somebody who works a 9-to-5 job, give them a midday time to come along, and they can never do it. So repeating the same thing, although I realize that's probably quite hard on a smaller scale when you've got less students already. That was a very long answer.
I think the other thing is what Patty touched on, is understanding the volume of student voice and student data that your institution holds in different departments, and trying to avoid that kind of siloed way of working where one team potentially has the answer to the questions that you want, but you're not kind of reaching out to them. So at the Open University, we really are trying to do a lot of cross-team working, make sure that we've got a lot of different departments represented on different groups, so that we can all feed in and understand whether there is the opportunity to engage with student voice from other teams and data that they've collected rather than having to go out directly to our students.
If we can just give a round of applause again, please, to Eve, Vic, Fanny and Patty. Thank you very much. I now invite to the stage, please, Myfanwy, Davies and Nyah Lowe from Bangor University, who are going to be talking about embedding research on student engagement in learning, lessons from the first Welsh Collaborative Enhancement Project.
Hello, prynhawn da, as we say in Wales. First of all, I want to thank QAA Cymru for funding part of the study we'll be reporting today, and also for enabling Nyah and I to come to wonderful Scotland to take part in these thoughtful and really valuable discussions. It's been very exciting, and you should be very proud of where you are as a sector. So I'm Myfanwy, I'm Head of Quality Enhancement at Bangor and part-time sociologist still, and I'm presenting jointly with Nyah Lowe, who is the president of our SU in Bangor. Our presentation is in two parts. So firstly, I'll outline how this enhancement theme was initially developed in Wales. I'll describe our study and focus in particular on informal social learning. I'll hand over to Nyah for the second part, which will describe what you might call the study's afterlife. She'll set out how key study findings informed the SU's research and how this led to practical changes now in place and ongoing strategic discussions. Right, great. So in 2020, QAA Cymru began to formulate an enhancement-led approach that included small-scale collaborative enhancement projects. So we are behind where you are in Scotland. During early 2021, the INDEB Bangor contribution to the Student Futures report indicated that the lack of peer and staff interaction during the lockdown may have had an impact on student learning, as well as a sense of isolation. And this concern was also reflected in some internal reporting that we had. So a wider stakeholder group at Bangor, including staff and student leaders, felt that research on students' patterns of engagement would be a valuable thing to do. So I produced a digest of research on student engagement that was initially discussed internally. But in order to promote a Wales-wide discussion on a potential enhancement theme, I presented it to the Wales Quality Network, and it was also passed on to the Learning and Teaching Network, which is our PVC's group. So the key message of that digest was that student engagement is pervasive, but very, very broadly defined. The upshift in interest, and there was a huge upshift in interest in student engagement, happens around the time that the NSS begins to become important. And later on, the focus moves to student retention. In terms of engagement in learning more narrowly, the research is focused strongly on active participation in class. But reporting is not always clear, with a major HEA review finding out of 21,000 items, only 2% met quality criteria, such as discussion of the study's approach, its design, and the reporting of data. So this is a key area, but it's in need of clarity and more well-designed interventions. The interventions we found were mostly in business and medical education, which led us to wonder about disciplinary differences. So following discussion, the Bangor group chose to explore students' experiences of the return to campus. Now, our neighbour and long-term collaborator, Grŵp Llandrillo Menai, is Wales's largest group of FE colleges, also offering HE, and they decided to join us on this study. Their priority, though, was to address retention and progression, because those were the challenges they were facing. And in May 2021, our team was awarded funding from QAA Cymru to undertake the project. So the concept of student engagement is pervasive, but it's ambiguous, and in order to promote it effectively, we need clarity. As I mentioned, we had specific questions relating to patterns of engagement in learning on and off campus, and factors that drive retention and progression. But we also wanted to identify and to share high-quality interventions and to establish some clarity about what they achieved. So we profiled the engagement of students in timetabled events and their use of materials using the existing systems that we have. We won't go into too much detail about that today, but we found that this was driven by initial orientation to a module and then by assessment points for students, but also, interestingly, for staff as well. We conducted an evaluative review of interventions to support student engagement, and we'll come back to that. But the main finding that we want to focus on today are from the focus group interviews. These were conducted in each college at Bangor as kind of proxy for discipline and at GLlM, Grŵp Llandrillo. And I was present at all of them, but they were facilitated by Undeb Bangor's student voice manager, so it was always a real partnership with both of us in the room. In total, we had 32 participants, mostly white. They were gender balanced, and students were under 25. So here are some participant quotes that illustrate the main themes. So the strongest motivator for engagement in learning was contact with other students, particularly when students chose to create their own informal groups. Across all groups, peer contact enables participants to commit to their learning, and when students started a course, they might feel overwhelmed, but sharing notes with others helped them settle into their experience and find some basics that they could orientate towards. Students at Bangor had access to a shared study space during blended learning, and many would talk to peers who were not their close friends in order to check their understanding of a concept. In the weeks before an assessment was due, similar conversations focused on testing an approach to that question. Students in the GLlM sample who had access to informal online discussion groups, such as WhatsApp, would post their ideas for comment. And this was seen as being very useful and a considerable improvement on turning up to class and instigating discussions with people who might not have time to talk at that particular point. Students felt very strongly about that. Students also made sense of feedback and assessment through peer discussion. They used peer contact either in the social learning space, the physical one, or online to contextualize and take a more measured view of their performance immediately following an assessment. This practice might have real benefit for performance where assessment is clustered and students need to make sense of feedback fast and act upon it. And this quote also suggests that comparing feedback might help raise students' confidence before taking up offers of discussions with staff, the more formal discussions around feedback. And in cases where generic feedback is used, in general, the class did this or that, peer discussion may be particularly useful. So we also explored the conditions that nurtured peer-to-peer learning. Study spaces were used heavily by the BU students, and the quotation here makes the point that study spaces support contact with peers who are not personal friends, and that informal contact about learning can make the difference between being engaged and not being engaged. Study spaces may be equally useful online. At GLlM, where in-person teaching was disrupted but was resumed sooner, WhatsApp or Facebook groups had become viable as ways to supplement the face-to-face community. So in terms of ensuring that the right conditions are in place to support social learning, we found a variation in views. GLlM students felt that the lecturer was a key instigator of students' engagement and referred to the need for the lecturer to create a relationship of trust, support and mutual respect with students. And I was reminded during Jackie Brodie's presentation yesterday that this is a notion of growing engagement, like nurturing a garden. GLlM students viewed optimum conditions for social learning as being a kind of triangle of individual motivation, lecturer support, and students' individual responsibility for their learning. So in general, we can say that this exploratory study, and it was small, found that peer-to-peer interaction was highly valued by students and underpinned key aspects of their learning. Now, we conducted an evaluative review in parallel to the focus group study so that we could identify interventions that would be relevant to the key findings. This slide here describes our search strategy. A total of around 1,000 items were initially collected. We then applied the quality criteria, the same ones as I mentioned before, around clarity of approach, design, reporting of data. We also added a journal impact factor of more than 1, which is not very high, so we were being very pragmatic. We also excluded papers more than 20 years old so that they were current. And through this process, we found 60 interventions that reported what we perceived to be replicable interventions. Of these, just under half focused on what you might call classroom interventions, that is, approaches that were led by lecturers within the classroom. They related to assessment and feedback techniques, particularly to active learning interventions, the development of critical thinking, the use of flipped lectures, and simulation learning. And the main outcome measure used was student performance, followed by student perceptions. There was also some reporting of behavioural or attitudinal changes like class participation, confidence and self-efficacy. We found a small number of interventions that used elements of peer learning in group work, for example, but none where it was the focus of the intervention itself. As we were writing our study up, the first English-based collaborative enhancement project was coming to a close. This used a survey with a much wider ethnically stratified sample of around 900 students with follow-up focus groups. Among other findings, they report that Black, Arab and some Asian groups had better learning experience in 2021 while white students had a poorer one. And this finding made us wonder whether peer-to-peer interaction benefits white students more than others and what conditions might make that so, and therefore how we should intervene. So really quick note on EDI and interventions. Successful interventions for BAME groups have mostly used staff-led mentoring. Early intervention and formative feedback has also been found to boost retention and progression for at-risk groups and BAME students. There's some evidence that students studying in their non-native language may find that they have limited opportunities to take part in informal social learning. We're interested in learning more about how non-white and non-majority students experience peer-to-peer and informal learning. We're particularly interested in patterns of informal learning within larger groups of international students who don't have English as a first language. For us in Bangor, the obvious group to look at too would be Welsh speakers, but we are keen to work with other HEIs with large UK BAME populations, especially when they're clustered around particular subjects. And we'd be interested to use in-depth methods like student-led ethnographies. Now, had this been a traditional academic study, that would have been the extent of its ongoing impact. But because it was co-designed by our student and staff bodies and across 2 institutions, and we had reporting requirements to the QAA, it's been much more widely owned. Findings were presented at multiple fora, including our teaching and learning group, twice in fact, and the Wales Quality Network. And these discussions were happening at the university while we were developing a new estate strategy. So drawing particularly on findings relating to informal peer learning, the SU designed and undertook a specific survey on student study spaces and also taking into account some findings on learning styles. The last point on the slide relates to our phase 2 study, which we'll come back to. But I'm going to hand over to Nyah, who will outline the key findings of the study spaces survey and assess the overall cumulative impact of both studies.
So we did a study spaces survey, both on the back of this research, but also on the back of a student outcry after a couple of our study spaces were closed down under the belief that having one central study space would bring students together and create a sense of belonging. However, that didn't happen in reality. What actually happened was students who were science students lost their science study space that was more tailored to them over time. And so computers and desktops and that sort of environment was better to them, but they didn't have that in the central library anymore. So there was a bit of an outcry from those students, but also from other students who had lost their study areas. And so we did a bit of research on what different students need, but also what the larger student body needs and how that interacts with the sense of belonging as well. So we ran a study spaces survey across all students, and this was open for 1 month and had 524 responses, 77% of whom used the study spaces, so we disregarded the 33% who didn't, with the intent to further research on those 33% of responses as to why and how we could boost that engagement at a later date. So our key findings were that there was a lack of quiet study spaces, so people walking through, people chatting, people being loud, because there was one central study space, so people were using that for group study, but also as individual study, and that interaction wasn't working well for students. And so we were looking at interventions to potentially segregate different study areas into quiet, silent, and social study spaces to give more of an interaction between those different students. There was also a lack of charging ports, and this is definitely more of an estates issue because our university is very, very old and very, very listed. So there are not many charging points, and it's a big, big one that we're working with estates at the minute. It seems like a very small issue, but people bringing their own laptops and phones and music or presentations, that sort of thing, is quite debilitating for different modes of study. Also, out-of-hours provision is needed quite desperately. Before COVID, we had 24-hour library provision, but after COVID, that hasn't been brought back. There's quite a lot of medical students, mature students, commuter students who need that out-of-hours provision because they've got children that they need to look after during the day, or they're in lectures all day, or in placements all day. So those different types of students need the different hours of study space as well. We touched on already different spaces for quiet, silent, and group study. And equipment to heat food and drinks is also really necessary to students in terms of being able to stay there for long periods of time, but also to feel comfortable and to get the sort of daily needs in as well. So food, drink, close access to toilets, that sort of thing. Really standard, but actually not thought about very often in terms of study space. Also, there is a lack of disabled access and accessible desks at the minute, which we're working with estates to solve as well. On the topic of disabilities, we found that neurodivergent students answering our questionnaires had a lot to say around the accessibility of study spaces. For example, background noise, but also the accessibility of technology and the brightness of the computers, the brightness of the rooms, the loudness of the fans, people walking through, that sort of thing. And so wanted to speak a little bit to the solutions. So the university has now a task and end group to focus on improvements off the back of this study, but also off the back of Myfanwy's study, so that we can focus on short-term but also long-term solutions to some of the problems these two studies have identified. Within that group, we've identified some short-term fixes, for example, adding more plug sockets, some more temporary plug sockets, but also doing an assessment across all university lecture theatres and study spaces to assess the decibels of noise, background noise, to write them down and make sure that neurodivergent students are aware of that or not placed in those rooms, and working collaboratively to reduce the noise levels, but also for lecturers to be mindful of these students in lectures as well. There's also the development of a new study area in Pontio, targeting some of the problems that we found in this study area, that the lack of provision. For example, focusing on science students who need desktops and more coding type equipment for individual study, but also focusing on students from the history, law, social sciences schools who need more group study areas, more comfortable environments to work as a group and work on creative social ideas. So we also are looking at silent, quiet and social study areas and what that means to different groups of students. So took it to the all students meeting and said, what does a quiet study space look to you? Does that mean you can use phones? Does that mean you can use laptops on loud? Does that mean you can practice presentations? Or is it completely silent? And what are the expectations of those different rooms, so we can outline them collaboratively with the university and students, so everybody knows what to expect and where to go when they need different types of study areas. So from this study, considerations for future work include looking at the backgrounds and the needs of different students, looking at where have students come from, their culture, social background, friends and family, disability, identity. For example, in this work, extroverted and introverted students had different ideas of what study spaces meant to them. For example, extroverted students wanted more group study space, social study space, but introverted students wanted more individual desktop stations and separated out study areas. Additionally, neurodivergent students will have different needs in terms of noise, accessible requirements, and the space around the university in which they inhabit. What major external factors are affecting students? So the cost of living, degree value strikes. Advanced HE had a really interesting data set around the amount that students were staying at home versus coming into campus. It found that overall students were coming into campus less, but the times they were coming into campus, they were staying on campus more. So over the whole time, they were on the campus less, but if they had a lecture, they'd often stay around for a couple of hours to do self-study in study areas, and how we can target interventions to that as well. Looking at what courses students are on, the expectations of those courses, the mindset, the method. Science students are more needing desktops, need to individual study, but also might need to collaboratively study in terms of presenting different scientific data sets to different students and check understanding, and knowing that PhD students might actually want more of a sense of community because they work on their own quite a lot of the time, and study areas and social spaces are the only time in which they'll interact with different PhD students and different students across the rest of the university as well. Also looking at distance learning, learners on or off campus, less relevant to the study spaces element, but really relevant to Myfanwy's work on targeting student engagement across online learning, but also in-person learning, and looking at the different needs of those students. So I'd like to hand back to Myfanwy now on the conclusions.
Should we jump over this, because I think we're almost out of time, aren't we?
Okay. So there's a slide on join us. So we'd like to invite you to join us and work on this piece of work as well, because it's a really, really large topic that's really interesting, but also works a lot better if data sets are combined and further research is done on this. For example, other universities looking into neurodivergent students, into EDI issues surrounding study spaces and student engagement, and collaborating these data sets with ours as well will help boost further research. So sharing data and key enhancements among institutions is a really key one, and finding creative and alternative methods to boost engagement in teaching, assessment practice, and feedback collection are three main topics. So alternative methods being methods that have happened over COVID, methods to boost engagement and that sort of thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Myfanwy and Nyah. Are there any questions from the audience or from online as well, please? Yeah, please, at the back. We can just wait till the microphone comes to you, if that'd be okay. Thank you very much.
I'm Abby from GCU. The question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the participants of the study initially, they were all home students in a traditional setting. So how, in terms of like the theme of today's session as well, so how applicable those interventions in traditional settings, including metro learners, part-timers, distance learners, satellite campuses, just wondering.
I didn't choose the stream, but I would say not particularly applicable at the moment. That is why we want people to join us. That's why we want universities with large BAME populations in specific subject areas, for example, in management or in medicine. We want to see how those learning communities, how that peer-to-peer learning works, because it worries us that what might have happened during the lockdown was that something became apparent, which is that peer-to-peer learning works best for white students. So in a sense, I guess our study does reinforce that. Peer-to-peer learning worked well for these students. They weren't entirely homogenous, but they were white and European, and they were traditional. So what I'd say is please join us, and let's do more work on it so we can really understand how it works.
Much.
Thank you. Question right down at the front, if that's okay, if we can just wait for the microphone in Nazira. Thank you.
I'm quite conscious of time, but I can talk to you afterwards. You know, I know we're running short on time.
It's okay, we've got at least 6 minutes for questions.
Oh, good. I was late, so that's why I'm running for time. My question, I'm Nazira Karodia, Edinburgh Napier. My question is just to follow on from the last one and your response. You say that the white students prefer the peer-to-peer learning. Should we turn that question around, whether your other students don't feel that sense of belonging? Or maybe I've put in my tone onto it. I think the question is there a sense of belonging question?
I think there is, yes. We don't understand it properly yet. I should say this is a very small study, very broad, and it lacks depth because it was meant to be designed across institutions. So I don't have all the answers, but what I would say is that we do need to do more research on it. I think that potentially peer-to-peer learning could work in a really good way within minorities. In Bangor, we have 40% of our students are Welsh. Most of them speak some Welsh. So it would be interesting to look at how that community works, because while it is white, it is very much a minority community. But we're very, very interested in finding how it works for international students who don't speak the majority language, maybe Chinese students, for example. And we really do want to find out how it works for large BAME populations in different universities from ours, because we don't have a very large UK BAME population where we are.
So in our study spaces survey, we actually had a set of questions at the very start to identify the types of students which were answering our survey. And in that, we had a really high crossover between distance learners, PhD students and mature students who were international students and identified themselves from a BAME background. I know there's a lot of controversy over that term, but at the minute it's what QAA uses. So from that background of students, there were loads of students who weren't actually on campus, so not engaging with study areas and that sort of thing. And so I think that's got a different interaction, but not necessarily a worse interaction with peer-to-peer, because their peer-to-peer is online rather than in person. And so there's a lot more work to be done around that on increasing online peer-to-peer engagement as well as in-person engagement too.
Probably got time for one more question, if there's another question. If I would like to ask a question, if that's okay. So in the survey that you were doing and also the literature review, did any of the, I guess, technologies that are already existing at the university come up as a way of enabling this peer-to-peer learning, like virtual learning environments such as Moodle or Blackboard, or was it rather that students were doing it in spite of these technologies rather than because of them?
Shall I go first, Tom? It wasn't particularly clear in Bangor, but for the sample in Grŵp Llanrich who are mostly non-traditional students, many of them are working, they were encouraged to set up WhatsApp groups, and they worked brilliantly for them. It's a way that, you know, introvert people maybe can also participate in group work, because a lot of them were saying we feel uncomfortable, we don't really know the people very well, so it's easier for us to post a question. So that did work, but it was mostly for our HE and FE sample.
Please may you quickly repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. It's just basically the technologies that already exist at like Bangor, such as Moodle or Blackboard. Were students using those to engage with each other, or were they using things more like WhatsApp and Facebook and other technologies instead?
I think there's a large engagement with WhatsApp groups that work for some cohorts of students but don't work for others, particularly international students who have different social medias or different platforms that they use more than others. But also looking at advancements in technology made over COVID, for example, virtual reality. There's a couple of lecturers in Bangor who are looking at virtual reality practicals, so engaging disabled students who can't make practicals in practicals using VR. And so that technology already exists. It's just embedding that within the learning is super, super important, and there's a lot more work that we can do there that Bangor's starting to take the first steps to, but hopefully we'll continue to pick up the pace on those developments as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you can just join me in a round of applause for Myfanwy and Nyah again, please. Thank you.